via a foul order, a disgusting work environment, or recalling a disgusting experience led individuals to assign harsher punishments to others who had committed moral transgressions. So you describe a moral transgression, maybe breaking a law, you expose the people in the experiment to some disgusting stimulus, and then you ask them about the probability that the person was guilty, and then also how long they should be imprisoned or how much they should be fined. And if you get the people disgusted, then the probability, especially if they're orderly, then the probability of assigning a harsh punishment goes upward. So if you're ever in court, don't disgust the judge, right? That's part of the deal. Harsher moral judgments can even be induced following the consumption of a bitter drink, because bitter substances are often poison, or poisonous substances are often bitter, and that induces a disgust response as well. Although you can overcome that. Coffee is bitter, olives are bitter, so you can retrain your system to accept those things as food, but it's not particularly easy. In addition, the same disgust-related facial expressions are observed in response to unpleasant tastes, disgusting photographs, and receiving unfair treatment in an economic game. Concerns about cleanliness and interesting. So some of you may know I was at McMaster University a couple of weeks ago, and there were a bunch of protesters there, and I went up to meet the protesters because I kind of wanted to see what would happen. There were a bunch of them around the back of the room, and I offered to shake their hands, and mostly what I got was disgust faces, and that's not good. That's not good. So here's something to know too. Here's a good predictor of whether or not you're going to get divorced. You go into the therapist's office and you talk, the two of you talk, and you roll your eyes. That'll predict. If you're rolling your eyes at your partner, you're going to divorce them. Why? It's a disgust response, right? It's something like, I'm lifting you up with my eyes and throwing you into the garbage. It's something like that. But eye rolling is a great predictor of the probability of divorce. So it's something to keep in mind with regards to your relationships. Like if you're starting to develop some contempt or some disgust, you bloody well better get on that right away, because that's a bad road to go down. And so then you have to do whatever you have to do not to go down that road. Yeah, so, see, one of the things I think that's happening on the political landscape, and like we know, for example, that the more authoritarian politically correct types are high in agreeableness and high in orderliness, so that's a very interesting combination. And I think what's happening is that they're very rapidly dividing the world into contemptible predator. Like a snake's often elicit a disgust response, right? A predator will elicit a disgust response, like a crocodile or an alligator or a snake or something like that. And so it's the predator response that's being evoked to the people who are on the other side of the political spectrum, roughly speaking. And so they're categorized as like contemptible predators, something like that. And the people that are being protected are like innocent victims. That's how it appears. And that's a very, very dangerous thing to have happen, as I'll show you. Concerns about cleanliness and feelings of disgust have likewise been related to political attitudes. Situational reminders of the importance of physical cleanliness, such as asking participants to wipe their hands with antiseptic wipes, tend to increase self-reported political conservatism. Such as finding is consistent with the notion that purity tends to be valued more highly by conservatives than by liberals. Individuals who report being disgusted more easily also tend to hold more conservative political views on topics including abortion, gay marriage, tax cuts, and affirmative action. In addition to the effects that have emerged when using self-reported disgust sensitivity, more conservative political views have also been associated with stronger physiological reactivity to disgusting images. There's a lawyer, Martha Nussbaum, who's also a political philosopher, who says that we should eliminate the effect of disgust on our political theorizing, that disgust shouldn't be something that's considered as a valid means of information from which you might derive political conclusions. So if I find your behavior disgusting, or if you find my behavior disgusting, according to Nussbaum, that should be independent. You should try to make that rationally independent of your political views. I'd like to believe that, but there's a problem, and this is the problem that we're going to go through. You can't muck about with these underlying systems. You can't just say, ignore the reports of your disgust system, because it isn't like your emotions are insane and irrational and you have the rationality on top of that that's guiding you properly. That isn't how it works. All of these underlying biological systems guide you, and to the degree that the degree to which you're guided properly is a consequence of the balance of the action of these underlying biological systems, but the balance is very complexly maintained. You need a disgust system, because if you didn't, you'd eat something that would kill you, and then you would die. Or you'd do something stupid, and you'd end up like you'd get cut, and it would be dirty, and you wouldn't clean it, and then you would die. So the idea that you can somehow just rationalize the output of the disgust system and decontaminate your political viewpoints as a consequence seems to me to be very, very naive. Not that there's no danger to it, because there's plenty of danger to it. In addition, a large literature has converged on the notion that there are two core dimensions of conservative political ideology: resistance to change and tolerance of inequality. Resistance to change reflects the extent to which people wish to maintain the status quo, while tolerance of inequality reflects the acceptance of an unequal distribution of resources and opportunities within society. Jost has done a lot of that work. Jost's supervisor is Mazarin Banaji, and Mazarin Banaji is a known Marxist. And so this is another place where political ideology contaminates, as far as I'm concerned, scientific inquiry, because Jost's work on let's say, resistance to change is predicated on the idea that the conservative inclination to support the maintenance of already existing structures is precisely equivalent to supporting an unjust system. And that's not a reasonable thing to do if you're looking at these sorts of things from a scientific perspective. You don't get to make judgments like that, but they're built into the questionnaires. So, resistance to change reflects the extent to which people wish to maintain the status quo, while tolerance of inequality reflects the acceptance of an unequal distribution of resources and opportunities within society. These two dimensions appear roughly aligned with social and economic conservatism as expressed in the constructs of right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, respectively. There is no left-wing authoritarian psychological scales. We're trying to derive one right now. But the reason for that is that after World War II, the social science community was responding to what had happened in Nazi Germany, and perfectly appropriately, and they examined right-wing authoritarianism as a consequence, but they never examined left-wing authoritarianism, because the prevailing, what would you call it, political landscape of the time made the idea that there could be left-wing authoritarianism sufficiently incorrect politically so that it was never analyzed from the perspective of social science, even though the evidence for left-wing authoritarianism, say by the end of the 1940s, was absolutely overwhelming, right? By the 1930s, people were reporting on what had happened in the Soviet Union, the forced dekulakization, for example, of the agricultural industry in the Soviet Union, and the consequent deaths of several million people in the Ukraine. It was all extraordinarily well documented. These core facets of conservatism are also closely related to the two higher order value dimensions described in moral foundations theory, which reflect preferences for order and tradition on the one hand, and preferences for egalitarianism on the other. Importantly, the motivational basis of these two dimensions appears to vary independently from one another, with an individual's overall political attitudes on a left-right spectrum emerging from their relative balance. These motives are also strongly rooted in basic personality characteristics, such that preferences for order and tradition are associated with higher levels of orderliness. Now, you might think that's obvious, right? Well, obviously, orderliness is associated with preference for order. That's not the issue. The issue is whether or not you can measure it, right? That's the issue. So these things seem self-evident, but it's taken a very long time to build up the instruments that allow them to be measured in such a way that you can also start to look at the correlates and the underlying psychophysiology. So it's by no means obvious. Higher levels of orderliness, an aspect of conscientiousness, and politeness, an aspect of agreeableness, as well as lower levels of openness and intellect. In contrast, preferences for egalitarianism are uniquely associated with compassion, an aspect of agreeableness. And that's exactly what we found when we were looking at political correctness, which is primarily predicted not by openness or by conscientiousness, but by agreeableness. Political conservatism can therefore be thought of as a social immune system, reflecting the extension of pathogen avoidance mechanisms to the integrity of the social system. borders, boundaries, right? That's the orderly person. We'll keep borders between concepts. We'll keep borders between people. We'll keep borders between towns. We'll keep borders between political ideas and religions and states. Why? Because we don't want the terrible things flooding in from everywhere. Now, the liberal will say, wait a minute, all the things flooding in from everywhere aren't terrible. They have great utility. And that's true. But the problem is, they're both true. They're both true at the same time because, well, and we'll document that as we move forward. So then the question is, well, how do you know when things should be more open and when things should be more closed? And the answer to that is, well, you better have a chat with everyone and find out what they think because it's a balance of probabilities. There's no way of determining it a priori. It's a balance of probabilities. And so you have to have a discussion to determine how wide the gates should be open and how narrow they should be closed. And that's also going to depend on the circumstances and the situation. So there's no way of, this is the thing that's so terrible about this. There's no way of determining a priori whose position is correct. Just as the behavioral, yes, in particular the social immune system would help to maintain order by suppressing any actions or individuals that deviate from a group's accepted social traditions. It has been reported, for example, that regions with higher levels of disease prevalence tend to be associated with higher levels of social conformity and autocratic rule. Individuals who feel more vulnerable to disease likewise report higher levels of ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Such basic concerns about pathogen avoidance may thus contribute to the desire for order and tradition among conservatives, along with the harsh moral judgments associated with violations of the social order. How do you purify something? How about with fire? That's something to keep in mind as we move towards the more political expressions of this. And the thing about something that's disgusting is you don't isolate it exactly. You destroy it, right? It's the thing you do with rats and insects, for example, is destroy them, right? And you do that with poison, you do it with fire, you do it by cleaning things up. And you do that because, well, the rats will eat all your crops and the insects carry disease and all of that. So or they infest your food, which you know, I don't know what proportion of today's food production is eaten by rats and insects, but it's a huge proportion still. According to the parasite stress hypothesis, authoritarian governments are more likely to emerge in regions characterized by a high prevalence of disease-causing pathogens. Now, who the hell would have ever guessed that? Hey, this is where you see the real utility of a genuine social science, because it's by no means self-evident, this hypothesis. And this paper that I'm going to discuss with you right now just blew me away when I read it. I thought it should have been front page news across the world, but it didn't really attract that much attention. Recent cross-national evidence is consistent with this hypothesis, but there are inferential limitations associated with that evidence. We report 2 studies that address some of the limitations and provide further tests of the hypothesis. Study 1 revealed that parasite prevalence strongly predicted cross-national differences on measures assessing individuals' authoritarian personalities. So that's very interesting. So the more parasitic and transmissible diseases in a particular locale, the higher the probability that people, when measured at the individual level, held authoritarian attitudes. Because you might say, well, there's parasite prevalence, that produces a repressive government, but it doesn't really affect people at the level of personality. And that's not what was found in the studies. It was reversed. The parasite prevalence / infectious diseases made people more authoritarian, and that was what was driving the more authoritarian government. So here's something cool. Who knows about this, right? So how do you fight authoritarian governments across the world? You get rid of infectious disease. That could be it. That could be the key. So, and then again, that is by no means a self-evident hypothesis. Study 1 that revealed that parasite prevalence strongly predicted cross-national differences on measures assessing individuals' authoritarian personalities. And this effect statistically mediated the relationship between parasite prevalence and authoritarian governance. Parasites, personality, authoritarian state. That's the causal pathway. This mediation result is inconsistent with alternative explanations for previous findings. To address further limitations associated with cross-national comparisons, Study 2 tested the parasite stress hypothesis on a sample of traditional small-scale societies. Results revealed that parasite prevalence predicted measures of authoritarian governance and did so even when statistically controlling for other threats to human welfare. One additional threat, famine, also uniquely predicted authoritarianism. Together, these results further substantiate the parasite stress hypothesis of authoritarianism and suggest that societal differences in authoritarian governance result in part from cultural differences in individuals' authoritarian personalities. Here's the effect sizes. So look, they're mind-boggling. So first, that's authoritarian governance. 1, pathogen prevalence. The correlation is 0.42. 0.42, right? There's malnutrition. There's warfare. It's actually negatively correlated with warfare. Famine, 0.26. So if you square that, that's about 8% of the variance. That's about 16% of the variance. So those are walloping effect sizes, right? That effect size is about, so that's 16%. The typical effect size for a personality variable is about 0.2 to 0.3, so let's say 0.25, so that's about 7% of the variance. That's 16 to 17% of the variance. You almost never see a correlation of that size. So it's an absolutely remarkable piece of work. And it has all sorts of terrifying implications. So the question is now, why would you have such a powerful immune system, behavioral immune system, disgust system? Okay, so let's look at some little known facts about the history of North America. I don't know how many of you guys know this, but it's worth knowing. Okay, so what was the pre-Columbian population of the Americas? The answer is, we don't really have any idea. The estimates vary from 10 million to 100 million, with an emerging consensus of 50 million. Well, it's halfway. Okay, we don't know. We could be out by 1 order of magnitude, but a fair number of people. So what happened to all the Native Americans? Well, that's easy. They all died. Why? Because when the Spaniards came, see, there was no diseases in the New World, except for maybe syphilis. There's some evidence that syphilis was transmitted back to Europe as a consequence of contact with North and South America. But there were almost no diseases in the Americas. And that's partly because there were no big cities, and also because even where there were, not compared to Europe, and also because where there were big cities in Europe, people lived close with animals, and there was lots of movement of disease pathogens back and forth between the animals and the human beings. And so lots of Europeans died as a consequence of that, like huge numbers of them, especially from diseases, say like smallpox or measles. But the Europeans built up a whopping immunity to all these diseases, including influenza, and then they came to the Americas with their diseases, and bang, it killed all the Native Americans. They figured 90% of them. So here's some of the statistics. What were the diseases that wiped them out? Influenza, bubonic plague, smallpox, measles. Even chickenpox was deadly to the Native Americans. So from 1492 to 1650, there was a death toll of 90%. So, you know, when the Puritans landed in the U.S. at Plymouth Rock, that was a long time after the Spaniards had landed in the more southern areas. The Indians, the Native Americans there, they were desperate to see them because they didn't have enough people to take off their crops. They didn't have enough people left. You imagine, 9 out of 10 people died. That's everyone, right? You're done at that point. And so there were 25 to 30 million people in Mexico before the arrival of Cortez. 50 years later, there were 3 million. So, and the Aboriginal population in Canada, estimates, this is accepted by the Canadian government, no one really knows, and the estimates do vary substantially. There might have been 500,000 people in Canada in 1450, and that decreased by 80% after contact with the Europeans. There's the population collapse in Mexico. 16th century population collapse in Mexico. So the 1545 and 1576 epidemics appear to have been hemorrhagic fevers caused by an indigenous viral agent and aggravated by unusual climatic conditions. The Mexican population did not recover to pre-Hispanic levels until the 20th century. Absolutely catastrophic consequences. So then you look at that and you think, well, is it really all that surprising that people have evolved extraordinarily powerful immune systems, disgust responses, and behavioral immune systems? I mean, this is no joke. It's absolutely catastrophic. So now, I want to talk to you a little bit about Hitler. So when I was sorting some of this stuff out, trying to look at this disgust sensitivity literature, and then understanding finally that it was associated with orderliness, and that orderliness was associated with conservatism, I was also reading a book by Adolf Hitler, which was called Hitler's Table Talk. It's a very interesting book. And Hitler had secretaries at his dinner tables from 1939 to 1942, and they basically took shorthand notes of what he said spontaneously. And so there's a book that you can buy called Hitler's Table Talk that that is nothing but a presentation of his spontaneous utterances across that time period. Now, Hitler was a very strange person. He was very high in openness, surprisingly enough, but also extremely high in orderliness. At least that's what you can infer from reading the historical data. So he bathed 4 times a day, for example. He was also a great admirer of willpower, which is something that's also associated with conscientiousness and orderliness. So he was very proud of his ability to stand like this for 8 hours in the back of a car, and his ability to withstand, what would you call them, trying circumstances by willpower alone. One of the most famous film documentaries that was made in the Nazi era was called Triumph of the Will, right? Triumph of Willpower. That was by Leni Riefenstahl. I'm not saying that quite right. You can look at that on YouTube. It's a very interesting film. Horrifying film, but a very interesting one. Well, if you're wondering about orderliness, take a look at that, man. So that's Nuremberg, right? That was the biggest rally grounds ever made in human history, Nuremberg. And Hitler was unbelievably good at spectacle. Look at how absolutely perfectly ordered that is. God only knows how many people there. Several 100,000, because they could all fit on the parade ground at the same time. All in absolutely perfect formation. Orderliness. Gone out of control. It's interesting because people think about Nazism as a descent into barbarity, right? But what it looks like is a disease of civilization. That's a whole different thing, because conscientiousness predicts success in complex industrial societies. And this is actually conscientiousness gone out of control on the orderly end of things. And why? Well, the World War I, that was plenty chaotic. And there was a huge famine after World War I, right? In Spanish influenza killed more people than the war did. And it actually mutated in the trenches, because if people are packed close together, then viruses or other pathogens can be very deadly, because you don't have to live very long to give it to her. If people are dispersed, then the virus or the bacteria can't afford to kill you as fast, because then it dies too. And so if you pack people together, then you can breed unbelievably virulent forms of pathogens, infectious pathogens, and that's what happened in World War I. Packed all the men together in unsanitary conditions, poof, up came Spanish influenza, went all around the world after World War I and killed more people than the war. So, and after the war, after World War I, of course, Germany descended into utter chaos. And so what happens when you descend into chaos? And the answer is there's a corresponding call for order. And that was answered by Hitler and the National Socialists. And Hitler was very good at listening to the German population, and what they were demanding in a period of chaos was order. And so that was exactly what he decided to provide. Spectacles of order, which is exactly what you'd expect from someone who is really high in openness and high in orderliness, right? Spectacles of order. And Hitler was also extremely interested in art, but he categorized art into like proper hygienic art and improper chaotic art, and he often would have art exhibits at the same time of the approved art that he approved of. So those were in the official museums, let's say, and then there would be a corresponding exhibit of degenerate art. And that was art that was associated with movements like Expressionism, for example, which has garish colors and it's very emotionally expressive. Hitler sort of preferred kind of eroticized Greco-Roman representations of heroic people. That was the Nazi aesthetic, essentially. So there are some more examples of order, right? Look at that. Everything geometric, everything regular, the borders completely well defined. Everything here is squares. Everyone's lined up perfectly. Everything is uniform, right? Look at, there's pathways between the rows of people. This is again at Nuremberg. Perfect order. Along with his plans for the world capital Germania, Albert Speer, that was the Nazi architect, made the plans for the world's largest stadium, which was to be located on the Nuremberg rally grounds. Derived from the Panathenaic Stadium of Athens, it would have offered 400,000 seats. It was to get the shape of a horseshoe. Planned dimensions, 800 meters wide, 450 meters high, 100 meters, with a building area of 350,000 square meters. The laying of the foundation stone was on 9th of July, 1937. It was to be finished for the Party Congress of 1945. In 1938, the construction began with the excavation. It was stopped in 1939, but during the whole war, the casting pit had to be kept dry from entering groundwater. After the war, the northern half of the pit filled up with water and is today called Silver Lake. The southern half was used to deposit the debris of the destroyed downtown Nuremberg. That's Nuremberg at night. So what Hitler did, because he was very good at using fire and light as display as well. So that curtain there, so you see there's the Nuremberg buildings that we saw in the last photograph. Those are the searchlights from the Nazi Air Force. So they had them arrayed all the way around the grounds there and pointed straight up, so that the nighttime rallies were illuminated by a cube of light. Very effective display, artistic display of orderliness. Now, here's where things get seriously ugly. So this is a pamphlet from, I think, 1944, and the pamphlet is called Jew as World Parasite. So this is something I found on the net. I'll share it with you. Very rare, original, late 1944 anti-Jewish Third Reich pamphlet. This very scarce 6 by 8 3/4, 20-page softcover booklet by M.L. Reifer and Erich Schwartzberg was published 1944 in Frankfurt. It was published at a time when a great percentage of the European Jews had already been deported to concentration camps in the East, perhaps to justify what had happened to the Jews since the Nazi seizure of power. The authors compare the Jews with parasites, the most unpleasant forms of life on earth, and that it is only natural and justified against them to free humanity of them for the sake and survival of mankind. This is from the pamphlet. The people of the world will recognize the Jew as world parasite, and there will be a time when there will be one united front of all people against the Jewish world parasite. The pamphlet ends, and humanity will be freed from the most severe illness from which it suffered from thousands of years. Here's what happened in Nazi Germany. So when Hitler came to power, he was very interested in public health campaigns. And so he formulated a number of policies, including formulating these vans that went around screening people for tuberculosis. And at the same time, he announced a policy to beautify and purify Germany. And so he encouraged the factory owners to clean up the factories, to get rid of the rats and the insects, and to plant flowers and so forth in front, right? So it was cleanliness and beauty. They used Zyklon B as the agent for disinfecting the factories. Zyklon B was the gas that was used in the gas chambers. So Hitler started out by getting rid of the rats and the parasites and the insects in Germany, along with his public health campaign. And then he moved into the insane asylums and started a euthanasia campaign. And then he moved outside into the broader political sphere and started to target the people that he didn't consider pure as parasites, capitalizing on the behavioral immune system and people's intrinsic sense of disgust. And so I'm going to show you some of the propaganda that did that, so that you know how this sort of thing works. Okay, so this is from Richard Koenigsberg, who wrote a book called Hitler's Ideology, Embodied Metaphor, Fantasy, and History. So we've already sort of discussed the idea. This is sort of an archetypal idea, grounded in biology, that you're run in some sense on this underlying biological platform of deeply rooted hypothalamic systems and amygdalic systems and so forth, and that you're a collection of those underlying systems organized at some higher order level. Well, those underlying systems manifest themselves in fantasy. So, for example, if you're hungry, you're going to get a fantasy about going to get something to eat. And if you're lonely, you're going to get a fantasy about someone that you'd like to be with, and so forth. Because the fantasy is part of the manner in which these underlying biological motivation systems think. Okay, so what do you think? How do you think and talk if you're possessed by disgust? Okay. The state did, these are from Hitler's utterances. The state did not possess the power to master the disease. The menacing decay of the Reich was manifest. The masses feel that the mere fact of the Jews' existence is as bad as the plague. Politicians tinkering around on the German national body saw at most the forms of our general disease, but blindly ignored the virus. At the time of the unification, the inner decay was already in full swing, and the general situation was deteriorating from year to year. The nation did not grow inwardly healthier, but obviously languished more and more. It's all disease metaphor. It's all disease metaphor. The symptoms of decay of the pre-war period can be reduced to racial causes. Anyone who wants to cure this era, which is inwardly sick and rotten, must first of all summon up the courage to make clear the causes of the disease. They think that they must demonstrate that they are ready for appeasement so as to stay the deadly cancerous ulcer through a policy of moderation. The Jew must take care that the plague does not die. If this battle should not come, Germany would decay and at best would sink to ruin like a rotting corpse. You can see in the Reich today an example of mortal decay. That is not the speech of someone who's possessed by anxiety. That's the speech of someone who's possessed by disgust. They're not the same thing. The 1st of May can only be the liberation of the nation's spirit from the infection of internationalism, the restoration to health of peoples. Against the infection of materialism, against the Jewish pestilence, we must hold aloft a flaming ideal, another purification metaphor. The restoration to health of our people must start from the restoration to health of the body politic. So that was Hitler's essential metaphor. The nation was a body. Right? It was a pure body. It was a pure Aryan body. And it was being assaulted by parasites that were subjecting it to disease and decay. That's the fundamental metaphor at the bottom of his political message. I gave the order to burn down to the raw flesh, Jesus, the ulcers of this poisoning of the wells. Yeah, pretty rough, man. This is the battle against a veritable world sickness which threatens to infect the peoples, a plague which devastates whole peoples, an international pestilence. The international carrier of the bacillus must be fought. It is if within this community one state is infected, that infection is decisive for all. In Europe, no common life of the nations is possible when amongst their number there are some who are suffering from a poisonous infection and who openly profess their desire to infect others with the same disease. We shall have a very real interest in seeing to it that the Bolshevist plague does not spread over Europe. National Socialism has made our people, and therefore the Reich, immune from a Bolshevik infection. I'll read you one more, although obviously you get the point. Table 7 is called "The National Body is Being Consumed." The Jew is and remains the typical parasite, a sponger who, like a noxious bacillus, keeps spreading as soon as a favorable medium invites him. All right, now I want to show you a brief film, and you can look here at the what would you call it, artistic and propagandistic transformation of the idea of order into a politicized message. And the thing that's so interesting about Hitler's particular brand of fascism, it wasn't precisely it wasn't precisely a movement that was predicated on ideas, like communism. Communism is predicated on ideas. But the Nazis went at it with something that wasn't really in the realm of idea. It was more in the realm of like embodied disgust and image. And so it was also very much more difficult to fight against from the ideational perspective. You know, it wasn't a well-developed intellectual movement. It was an embodied movement. And Hitler was extraordinarily good at using the metaphors and the images, and then his incredible capacity for propagandistic display to fire people up at a level of analysis that they weren't really even aware of. So let's take a look at this film.
The campaign in Poland gave us the opportunity to really get to know the Jewish people. Nearly 4 million Jews live here in Poland, but they won't be found among the rural population, nor have they suffered from the chaos of war as has the native Pole. They set it out indifferently in the gloomy streets of the Polish ghetto. Yet within an hour after the German occupation, they were back in business. We Germans had a look at the Polish ghetto 25 years ago. This time our eyes are sharpened by our experience in the last few decades. Unlike in 1914, we no longer see just the most grotesque and comical of these questionable ghetto figures. This time we recognize that there's a plague here, a plague that threatens the health of the Aryan peoples. Richard Wagner once said, "The Jew is the demon behind the corruption of mankind." And these pictures prove it. Jewish home life reveals remarkable lack of creative ability to civilize. In plain language, Jewish dwellings are filthy and neglected. These Jews aren't at all poor. After decades of business, they've hoarded enough to acquire decent, comfortable homes. But they live for generations in the same dirty and bug-ridden dwellings. Untroubled by their surroundings, they go right on with their prayers. The bobbing motion is part of the ritual for reading Jewish scriptures. The main part of Jewish so-called community life takes place in the street.
The connection with trade, you see what's going on in the... Okay, so with the juxtaposition of those two films, you see the juxtaposition of order versus chaos. And so part of the order versus chaos archetype obviously is rooted in the dichotomy between disgust and purity. It's not the only axis of opposition between order and chaos. And then, so this is all invocation of archetypal chaos, and it starts with the use of the disease imagery, and then also the use of music composed in a minor key and threatening and low, right? So that's all juxtaposed together. And then they switch to trade, again with this undertone of threat, and there's a hand-to-hand exchange of goods, and it seems to me that they're using the image to continue the metaphor that in this situation, trade is associated with contamination rather than with productivity, right? And so you can see obviously a dichotomy with regards to trade, because when you're taking goods from someone else, the question is, are the goods of high quality and useful, and are they useful, or are they something that is going to introduce a foreign element or an unexpected element into your house? And so this film is obviously taking that ambivalence that's associated with trade and placing it into the chaos order archetype and then associating it with disgust. So it's very, very sneaky. And it's done by inference rather than directly, which I think is a much more powerful way of doing this sort of thing. One of the things that's interesting too is that, you can imagine that if you're seeing people who are poor and downtrodden, that might evoke two possible sets of responses. One might be a compassionate response, that would be the desire to help, right? And the other would be the desire to distance yourself. Of course, you feel the same thing, for example, if you're walking down Bloor and you find somebody who's, a completely wrecked street person lying there in their sleeping bag in a doorway. It's like, well, what's your response going to be? Is it compassion, or is it fear? Is it disgust? Well, it's going to depend on your mood and all sorts of other things. It's going to depend on the particulars of the situation. It's going to depend on your temperament. But you can see that those two things, they're both automatically evocable responses, and it isn't self-evident which one is going to come to the fore, nor is it always self-evident which one should come to the fore, because part of the reason that you're ambivalent about a situation like that is because you have no idea what would happen even if you did choose to interact. And so you can't just simply, what would you say? There's no simple way of solving a problem like that. And so that's why there's a war of competing emotions when you're in a situation like that. But you could imagine as well, you could have taken the same images and put them to different music and used a different overlay, and it could have been a call to compassion. But that's not what it is here. It's a call to contempt and extermination. Because that's also another danger of, I suppose, insisting upon the fact that a given population is victimized. I suppose that might be one way of thinking about it, because there's two different sets of categorical responses to people who are at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, and one of them is compassion, but the other one is more like this. It's not necessarily something that you want to carelessly evoke.
One might want to regard these haggling children as a sign of great poverty. But watch them a while, and it becomes clear that they're proud to act as their grown-ups do. These young people don't have the idealism that ours do. With them, the egoism of the individual is not in the service of higher common goals. Instead, Jewish morality, in crass contradiction of the Aryan concept of ethics, proclaims the unrestrained egoism of every Jew to be divine law. His religion makes cheating and usury a duty. In the 5th book of Moses, for example, it is stated that a non-Jew thou may loan to upon usury, but not thy brother. That the Lord may bless thee in all thy dealings. For the Jews, then, doing business is something holy. This is totally incomprehensible to non-Jews. Aryan man attaches a sense of worth to every activity. He wants to create something worthwhile, food or clothing, houses or machines.
Yeah, so there's a contrast there. They actually use a contrast there between industrious and non-industrious too, which is quite interesting.
Works of art or anything else of value to everyone. He's ruled by the feeling of being responsible for his achievements. For the Jew, there's but one thing of value: money. How he gets it makes no difference. The first trade goods are generally worthless trash of all sorts. That's how the little Jews start out. Soon, they reach the point where they can sell from a tray, and before long, they've assembled a complete line of goods. Not long after, they own a regular stand. The most ambitious soon own a small shop and then a bigger shop. The most cunning, that is, the most unscrupulous, eventually have warehouses and banks. and move into the most splendid mansions in the cities, provided that they don't get in each other's way, as in the narrow ghettos of the East. That's why they try to escape to rich lands with rich people. They need other.
So in the next part of the film, there's something else that's done implicitly. So you'll see a globe, and then there's spread of migration, and the underlying metaphor there is, again, the spread of disease.
Peoples because they need the wares with which to do business. What creative Aryan peoples find of value has been reduced by the Jew to mere merchandise. He buys and sells, but produces nothing. The production he leaves to the workers and farmers of the host nation.
It's funny there's an echo of Marxist ideology in there too that's very interesting, because what the insistence is that the labor that goes into basic production qualifies as labor, but the labor that goes into mercantile activity doesn't qualify as labor at all. It's not like the Nazis were pro-capitalist by any stretch of the imagination. So there's this strange distinction drawn between, like, it's almost like physical production. That seems to be something that's valued. It's the use of your musculature, say. But then as soon as it's elevated up into trade, which is obviously a value-added process, I mean, that's almost self-evident, but it's put forward here as something that's only parasitical. That's right. And that's a commonality with the Marxism of the time.
The Jews are a people without farmers or workers, a race of parasites. Wherever the body of a nation shows a wound, they anchor themselves and feed on the decaying organism. They make business out of the sickness of the nations, and therefore endeavor to deepen and prolong all conditions of sickness. That's how it is in Poland and was in Germany. The Jews have been this way throughout their entire history. Their faces bear the age-old features of the perpetual sponger, the eternal Jew, who, in the course of time and worldwide wanderings, has always been the same. There's no difference between these Jews in Poland and those in Palestine, though the two are geographically separated. Palestine is the spiritual center of international Jewry, though the Jews are numerically insignificant there. Here at the Wailing Wall, they gather and mourn the fall of Jerusalem. Their homelessness, though, is a matter of choice, and in keeping with their entire history. 4,000 years ago, their Hebrew ancestors were already wandering. Out of the land of two rivers, they wandered along the sea to Egypt, where they ran a lucrative grain business for a while. When the country farmers and other Egyptians rose against the foreign usurers and speculators, they wandered once more and plundered their way to the Promised Land. They settled there, mercilessly looting the culturally superior rightful inhabitants. Here, in the course of centuries, from the Oriental Far Eastern racial mixture with Negroid admixture, the ultimate mongrelized Jews developed. Foreign from us Europeans born of totally different racial elements, they differ from us in body and above all in soul. We probably would never have been bothered by them had they stayed in their Oriental home. But the cosmopolitan empire of Alexander the Great, reaching from the Near East across half the Mediterranean, and especially the boundless world empire of the Romans, brought about the evolution of the trade and migratory traits of the Jews, who soon spread across the open Mediterranean area. While some of them settled in the large urban traffic and trade centers of the Mediterranean, others wandered relentlessly on across Spain, France, southern Germany, and England. Everywhere, they made themselves unwelcome. In Spain and France, the people rose openly against them in the 13th and 14th centuries, and they wandered on, mainly to Germany. There, they followed the path of the Aryan culture, creative Germans colonizing the East, till they finally found a gigantic new untapped reservoir in the Polish and Russian sections of Eastern Europe.
So, well, let's tie that together. We talked about the use of archetypes in stories. We talked about the relationship between archetypal symbolism and the biological underpinnings of the human psyche. And then you can see that manifesting itself in this sort of propaganda and the political positions that come out of it. You tap into the archetypal dimension. That's chaos versus order. You can place one against the other however you want from a propagandistic perspective, because you could make a film decrying excessive order. That's not a difficult thing to do, but that isn't what happens here. Order is associated with the sun and with what's good and with honest labor and with purity and with health, and chaos is associated with decay and disgust and impurity, and also with trade, which is extremely interesting. And the trade dynamic, you could see that in the second part of the film there. There was the implication that it was involvement in trade that was associated with this pathological spread, right? And so trade, that's another reflection of the ambivalence towards the transgression of borders. Is trade a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, that's always a political issue. It's a huge political issue right now, right? You're going to have internationalist trade, or you're going to close the borders. You're going to have internationalist trade and open it, or are you going to close the borders? And so the degree to which the borders should be open or closed, I think, generally speaking, is the prime political question. And of course, we're going through an absolute convulsion of that sort of argumentation again right now. Part of the reason I wanted to show you this, I mean, there's a variety of reasons. I wanted to show you how the archetype and the underlying biology are tightly associated, but I also wanted to show you how those associations can be hijacked, essentially, and used for propagandistic and political purposes, because you need to know that, because these sorts of things have they have the capacity for a very powerful emotional appeal, and the only possible way of resisting that, I would say, and avoiding the temptation of allowing extraordinarily complex issues to be catastrophically reduced to principles that are far too simple to do them justice, is to become at least aware to some degree of what the mechanisms for the production of such propaganda are and why they have such potency. Then you have at least some ghost of a chance of reducing your own, what would you call it, proclivity. We could even call it a temperamental proclivity to the kind of propagandistic information that happens to suit your temperament best. So, well, we all know the aftermath of this sort of thing, right? It was absolutely dreadful, and we're by no means out of the woods on that yet. You know, you see in Europe and in the United States increasingly calls for the nationalistic enclosure of borders again. You saw that with Trump and the building of the wall between Mexico and the United States. So these things can get very badly out of hand, and it's a very bad idea to allow things to swing too far to one way or too far to the other, because all hell breaks loose when you do that. And well, all right, we'll see you on Thursday.